les autres, oui, mais...
Oh, I didn't go all the way.
Yeah, all the way up. Okay, it's working also.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Oh, I don't want me to wait? Okay. I had the clock. I just wanted to get started. This is awesome. I really like these slides so far. Can you also do a third line with at AF Dudley 0? A F Dudley? Yep. Y 0. Awesome. All right. Yeah. Right here? Yeah. Okay, that works. That works for me behind. Next to the... All right, hi everyone. My name's Rick Dudley, as it says up there. It's really early here, which means it's 3:30 a.m. where I live. So I'm I'm always a little out of it when I'm here in Paris. The title of the talk is pretty much what the talk is about. So I guess there's two main themes to this talk and my previous talk at EthCC. One of them is that they're extemporaneous. Like I don't plan. So, we're here in this famous space, has all this historical significance, where things are done in a very European style. For those of you watching at some other time in some other place, I'm in a basement, I'm in a deep hole, and there's all these chairs. So I'm supposed to be like prepared, and like all these people are supposed to watch. But I'm actually much more interested in having an interactive or dynamic discussion. So I'm going to have everybody sort of ask their questions. I have some questions from Twitter. I'm going to answer those, and then people can come down and ask their questions. And then the other thing that these have in common is that we're in the blockchain space. We're building systems for adversarial environments, but as humans who've had relatively nice lives, it looks like everyone here has all their limbs, things have worked out pretty well. We focus on the carrots and not on the sticks, right? You can't have a functional Byzantine fault-tolerant, adversarial, tolerant of adversaries type of environment and not punish people. So, we have to be, as a community, prepared both to be punished and to punish others. And, I could get all philosophical about it, but I won't. I'll just say, look into operant conditioning, look into sort of like behavioral economics. So that's actually another point that I'm going to get to the questions very shortly. But the point is that a lot of times we're looking at economic models that I think, or economic, the history of economics has not, until very recently, economists didn't really have a behavioral model, a behavioral approach, or a behavioral modeling like approach, like a neuroeconomics or behavioral economics approach. And so you should, and game theory suffers from this. I mean, game theory for the most part exists outside of this sort of behavioral lineage. And so when we're designing our systems, we need to be aware that we may be referencing literature, or there may be even contemporaries producing literature today that may seem instructive or helpful, but doesn't really map to the adversarial, agent-based sort of environment that we're really operating in. And I think we have to be very sensitive to that, which is apropos of me asking the audience questions. So I'm going to answer some of the questions from Twitter that were just very kindly posted. I'm probably not going to attribute those. You can just go to Twitter and attribute them yourself. I'm not going to delete the tweets or anything. If you could call upon a higher power that has the ability to change one thing about Ethereum, what would the request be? Doesn't have to be technical. That was a really good question. I think I would have, I don't know, there's like an obviously snarky joke that I'm not going to make, but the polite version of it is, I would have had more history, more computer science history, more voting history. We're in France, a history of democracy, the home of democracy. 200 years ago, people started really thinking about democracies here. I would have had more of that historic knowledge inform the development of Ethereum. That's probably, especially both on the governance side of the foundation itself in those early days of early formation, as well as the the technical designs as well. Next question. How would you retire or not retire ETH 1.0 when 2.0 is live? That's a little technical, but the short version of it is you keep the old state available, the old data available, but you don't allow it to be updated. And you do the updates via an overlay on 2.0. So you have sort of this, which is kind of wonky, but you also have tooling that dissuades people from making updates to 1.0 in the first place. But yeah, you still have to support some sort of update functionality, but it's mostly like migrations. How would you implement an Ethereum 2 inflation treasury? Like, I wouldn't really. I mean, I guess I would simulate one. It's necessary, so I don't know. It's like a question I'm not a big fan of, which is what I said in Twitter. But yeah, my answer is basically I'd run a simulation. There's not really an easy, succinct answer to inflationary treasury management. I think that you need strong governance. It's just such an obviously intractable problem that trying to do it purely algorithmically, I think there's an appeal to having a commitment via algorithms, right? Sort of being like, we can't do these things, but to then be like, you can't be super prescriptive because that doesn't really, adversaries have an advantage and there's other issues with being too prescriptive. I think that you should be a certain level of prescriptive if you're going to be minting. Obviously, you definitely have to have some rules for minting new tokens in the future, but you also need to have some rules that are soft. Those are like programmatic rules, but you also need some social rules to address like what happens when that doesn't work. Taking all possible factors into account, what do you think is a better way forward for Ethereum? 1, focus on improving and optimizing Ethereum 1x and layer 2 tech. 2, focus on Ethereum 2.0 and the transition to it. Yes, ETH is trying to do both, but I think this is an interesting discussion. It is an interesting discussion, which we probably won't get into here. But yeah, so I worked on Casper a lot, like in the early days. We had these weekly calls, and I was on the calls and active, and we talked a bunch. I'm very optimistic about CBC Casper. I really liked Vlad's talk yesterday. So I think that research should continue, but if I had constrained resources, my primary concern would be getting the thing that I've already deployed stable and working and like have a reasonable projection into the future, right? I mean, right now, if you do the projections right now, the future's pretty bleak. So, people have to work towards actually building a system that has some kind of future, and so I think for me personally, I would be extremely focused on 1.0. Or 1x really, I think is a better way of thinking of it, and I would be, in particular, I already do focus on the areas of data availability and how do you access old historical state, because I think that there's some dishonesty around what is and is not necessary from the historical state. I'll get into that later if I get all ranty about that, but that was kind of last year, so I'm not really trying to do that so much this year. How much at risk is the Ethereum network from BGP attacks / firewalls, which is a funny slash? What node density distribution do you think the network has to reach to avoid stalling apart from total internet shutdown? How much of an improvement in okay, this is a bunch of questions. How much of an improvement in bandwidth constraints can we expect with Ethereum 2.0? So the last one, I have no idea. I mean, Ethereum 2.0 is like a bunch of napkins, right? And no one knows what the bandwidth constraints of that are going to be. How much at risk is the Ethereum well, the network isn't really at risk from BGP attacks, but your service is. I mean, your service is at dire risk. I mean, you have to be extremely careful about BGP attacks. One of my sort of like odd quasi-mentors, I mean, he would laugh if he sees this and I say he's a mentor, but he wrote a lot about BGP attacks in 2007. They're a real thing. People have lost money in the Bitcoin community due to BGP hacks. I haven't gotten it confirmed from anyone, even like a little birdie or whatever, but when you read the reports from Coinbase about the ETC hack, it looks like that was an Eclipse attack, which may or may not have, I mean, it was executed on the network layer in part, so BGP is in the network layer, so you need to be concerned about the network layer as a service, and obviously if you think of the network, the Ethereum network as a collection of Ethereum services, in that sense we all need to be concerned about BGP, because if someone manipulates the network, the BGP, the internet layer too much, nothing's going to work. But how much is that risk in practice? It's very low because, like, you know, Google cares more about getting hacked by the Chinese than, like, frankly, Ethereum people care about that. So they're going to, like, protect the internet for us. So that's why the risk for us is relatively low at this point. I actually did go to IETF 99 and discuss BGP security, and I actually asked the people who, you know, deploy the internet why BGP wasn't more secure, and it was a very enlightening discussion. But long story short, the blockchain community has an opportunity, especially at the IoT side of it, to fix this sort of core internet vulnerability, because IoT devices that need to connect to blockchains need a way of trusting the networks that they're connecting to, and they don't have another way of doing it without a secure BGP protocol. So I think it's super important. I've done a lot of personal research into it, not really so much from a client ask perspective. What node density distribution, blah, 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 blah. So yeah, I think the node density distribution question is interestingly, I mean, yeah, we would like to have a good distribution across the various ASNs of the internet to provide robustness. We might also want microwave radios. We might also want things like Althea mesh. We may also want satellite uplinks, these other things to maintain robustness. Something like Bitcoin fiber to provide robustness. I mean, I think those are all nice to haves that are more important, or not more important, but facilitate a good node distribution. So yeah, and I think total internet shutdown is an interesting sort of hand-wavy concept, because the United States government, as far as I can tell, has the autonomy to effectively completely shut down the internet for everyone. And there are, I think, you know, people who have thought about this and have made some countermeasures, but ultimately, you know, if the NSA wasn't like a fetishist that just only watches, we would be in a lot of trouble, because they have the ability to shut down everything. But luckily for us, they just like to watch, so they're not going to do that. What's the most likely way in which Ethereum 2 will fail, and what would I do about it? So I think the most likely way Ethereum 2 will fail is it'll never happen. That's just my sort of historical background in life. Like, I just generally think when you're suggesting these large transitions, there's a lot that can go wrong. There's a lot of existing momentum. There's existing miners. There's existing institutions. There's already friction to change. Whatever the multi-billion-dollar market cap is of Ethereum, those people have invested money. They may not want to have Ethereum 2.0 happen for a number of reasons. So I think those are kind of the biggest risks, just sort of normal failure, just normal large-scale project collapse. In terms of like technical risk, I'm not a big fan of the beacon chain model. So my basic critique of it is that economic load balancing is another way of saying the attacker always has a tempo against the network. Because the network has to advertise how it's going to load balance in advance of load balancing, the attacker the load balancing isn't doing anything to deter the attacker. So to load balance in an adversarial environment, you really have to give the various counterparties in the system the ability to sort of form on their own. Trying to load balance under consensus in an adversarial environment doesn't really, that sentence doesn't make a lot of sense to me based on my experiences. I think so my proposal, which I made, sort of casually and passing to people over the years, is app sharding. So you create a marketplace for validators. So you have a beacon chain, you have a main chain, and the main chain, primarily what the main chain is for bonding. So I have proof of work value that's on the main chain, and maybe I'm not running, some huge number of proof of work nodes, but we've sort of done that already. We've already minted a bunch of Ethereum, so we don't need to keep minting more Ethereum in that way. So we have this main chain, proof of work tokens. Before two counterparties get into an agreement, we both bond, or one party gets into bonds, and that advertises to another party that they're serious. They do a deal, basically, a smart contract agreement that is in a much different language than what we're using now on the main chain. That includes the validators, which are sort of like this third-party arbitrator, and the two counterparties, just to keep it simple. So all three of us get together on this beacon chain. We make an agreement. We then go off-chain and use proof of stake to actually execute on that agreement. And that scales, obviously, very, very well. Because very little is actually happening on the main chain. It's also cleanly recursive, right? It's very obvious to see how you make a recursive version of that where you have deep trees and sharding and a lot of complexity there. It's actually very straightforward. It's also obviously grossly underspecified because my talk isn't about specifications for scalable sharding solutions. But that's sort of hand-wavy, my suggestion as an alternative to the beacon chain. And as I said, because the beacon chain I don't think will load balance. So that covers all the questions from Twitter. A lot of people said they're very excited to be here. A number of them are here, so that's very nice. But does anyone in the audience have any questions? I'm happy to field questions from the audience. I suggest that you come down to where the projector is. And we're also happy to have just a discussion. If there's no queue, I'm in Europe, so it's a queue. So if there's no queue of people, I'll just have a conversation with Boris. That's cool too. We can handle it any number of ways.
Good morning.
Morning.
I am interested in your thoughts on using or adding dev rewards to Ethereum as a way to fund improvements, maintenance of the network?
That's a great question. So I think that there's a fundamental confusion or maybe just a lack of understanding when, how would you know in advance? So it's not really a criticism of people. It's just sort of, it would have been nice if we had known at the time. Ethereum was definitely underspecified on the governance side. And so I think that and I think Tezos is going in an interesting direction. I tend to side more with the Cosmos model of governance. Although I think that there's some interesting stuff that can come out of Tezos. Like it's hard to say, what will and will not come out of that. And so that was sort of an obvious preamble. I think it's a governance question, right? I think that if we had a functional governance system, then the token holders, the miners, the existing devs, dApp developers would be making staked, signals. They'd be making weighted signals. You'd make a proposal, and then every user, and only like 5% of the users are even going to vote, but like 5% of the users could then sort of signal/vote on these proposals, and we could sort of make decisions about that. I think it's obviously a good idea. I think it's obviously a way to actually run a sustainable system, but I understand how, you know, we didn't get there in the first try. I mean, I think that would be a great thing for the foundation to sort of spearhead. It would be a great thing for Consensus, the foundation. I mean, how much does Binance rely on the sort of openness of Ethereum to exist, right? So I think that those major stakeholders, if they could get together and suggest an inflation, that would be awesome. But, you know, history has told me that's not really how the world's going to work out. I have a nice question over here as well.
So we've got a number of groups that are both collaborating and competing to produce what we might call Ethereum 2.x. We've got the foundation itself, we've got Casper, various different Caspers, we've got Dfinity, we've got Polkadot, we've got, the list gets longer, and it's a substantial number. And each of these groups are collaborating to some extent. They depend on each other for information flows. They're also competing for the value, where the value migrates in the long term. So my question is, how do you think this collaboration competition is going to play out?
That's also a really good question. So I think probably the main problem in answering that question is that blockchains aren't businesses, right? I mean, that's really kind of counterintuitive. You would want to apply sort of a business logic to it. Like, this thing came out recently, like Palantir has never been profitable. I mean, that's like mind-boggling. Like, how does that make any sense that Palantir, this huge like industrial machine, has never turned a profit, right? So by no means a disrespectful claim to Dfinity, but like I can imagine Dfinity becomes the Palantir of blockchains, right? They have raised all this money, and I don't understand how VCs work. So somehow they've raised all this money, yet have no obligation to ever be profitable. And so they're just churning out like great BLS work, great random beacon work, all this, you know, great WASM work, and they're just like some sort of weird charity, effectively, that had like $25 million token sale, right? So I think that you know, that sort of kind of hard to foresee consequence situation. I think that's going to happen to a lot of these chains where they're not going to die, right? There's this zombie phenomena. Simon, formerly of Ujo, Consensus, did token curated markets thing. He had a token, and he was the only miner, right? He made his own token. He was the only miner. He's running, and someone was pumping his coin one day. And he was like, "What's going on? There's no activity on this project. I'm the only activity. I know there's none. Why is the price going up?" I think there's a lot of these sort of weird phenomena that are in the ecosystem that nothing prior to this has had. So I think that a lot of code reuse is how we're going to see a lot of collaboration. It's just people stealing code. I see a lot of adversarial sort of open collaboration, right? I don't see like people talk about like acquisitions, right? Like, oh, we buy a coin, we merge it, we do a one-to-one exchange or whatever, like a stock, like a sort of a company merger sort of concept. I'm sort of skeptical about that model, but I think that people definitely continue to steal code. I mean, I think that's actually one of the best models of collaboration in the space. Not the collaborative code usage. Oh, hey, I got this BLS library from Bram. It's awesome. But like the people are just straight stealing shit, right? Like there's a lot of that, and I think that's like also a cultural thing. Without getting all weird about that, I think that some people are culturally, they just don't. Stealing is a cultural construct, and so for them, it's not really what we would think of as stealing. I mean, again, I'm in Paris, so. You know, but I think that sort of dynamic is going to continue, and I mean, at this conference, there's a Web3 track. It's a whole track to Web3. I mean, Polkadot should, by any, you know, sort of conventional measure, be in direct competition to Ethereum. I mean, Tron. I mean, EOS has issued tokens on Ethereum. Tron has issued tokens on Ethereum. Their initial token, their initial sale was on Ethereum. those are competitive projects. I mean, directly competitive projects. And Tron is a fork of Ethereum J, as far as I can tell. Oh, I've screwed up the punchline to my joke, but from a show of hands in the audience, and I'll tell the people watching at home, how many people here know what Ethereum J is? Okay, that's like, let's call that just under 50%. How many of you have actually like used it or tried to run it or had any infrastructure? I think one person like kind of almost half waved their hand. And then as sort of this third question, to be a little trollish, so how much do you think the Ethereum J code base is worth? Right? If you call it Ethereum J, it's, no offense to Roman, it's worth, you know, maybe $100,000 or some ridiculously $1 million or so, less than the dev hours put into it. But if you rebrand it as Tron and you take out dev P2P and you put in a bunch of gRPC calls, all of a sudden it's like $1 billion project. Like, who knew, right? You know, Roman hopefully is got a boat from those guys or something. I mean, they should do something for him. But yeah, I think that those sort of really counterintuitive dynamics are what's going to define the blockchain space moving forward, and I think it will work both to inoculate against sort of hegemonic, you know, the Googles, Facebooks, Apples of the world, but I think it'll also, you know, slow down development in certain situations where you could have just got those 5 guys in a room and they could have just got it done in a week, but instead we've, you know, been hemming and hawing transcontinentally for 3 years about, you know, some dumb thing that just wouldn't have been a problem in a normal institution. And I believe there was another question. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I put this on Twitter, but
oh, I missed it.
It was very late.
Threading is bad too. I'm sorry.
That's fine. Okay. So I'm just going to read it right here. It's about state buildup. Do you believe in the medium-term future, mainnet nodes will fail to sync due to state buildup? And how would such a crisis play out?
Oh, I mean,
and is it resolvable?
Yeah, it's absolutely resolvable. Shout out to Alexi, Real Ledger Watch, who's bending over backwards, you know, fighting dragons. The guy's forging swords, then go fight the dragon. He's mining the ore. I mean, he's doing all the work. So, you know, shout out to him. I think that it is a tractable problem simply because I've talked to him about it, and he seems to believe it's tractable. And he's done so much research. You know, he really backs up what he says with the research. So I think it's possible. It's a real issue. I think, you know, good news, bad news. One day, Geth is going to turn off the event log, you know, index that it provides. And then, you know, good luck for the 90% of real apps that rely on the event log to do something. So the work that I do with Maker, we're transitioning off of the event log for other reasons. But, you know, the sort of the side effect, the knock-on side effect of that that's really helpful is if the event log were to go away, our system still works. Which is, I think, you know, it's really difficult to reason about how to build a robust full stack on the current Ethereum node code base. You know, if you're relying on Geth or parity, it's not clear how you actually write your app. And that's something that we work on a lot at Vulcanize. I'm not really going to talk about my own projects. I don't want people to bug me, but yeah.
In terms of the current configuration of the network, how much time do you think we have?
Oh, again, I mean, Alexi,
before it starts playing out.
Somewhere on the internet, he has like a chart where he's like, we're doomed. Boris, do you happen to know offhand what the number is?
It's like, the best numbers I've heard are like 2 to 3 years.
2 to 3 years sounds really good. I just realized that my archive node wasn't on the Constantinople fork. So I know that my archive node, like I'm literally gonna have to pay a dev like thousands of dollars to like go in and do like surgery on our archive node to fix the 6 days. You have, at one time I knew exactly what the number was because I was arguing with Nick Johnson about it, but I've forgotten the number. You have like way shorter time than you'd think for your node. It's 4 hours, I do remember the number. if your full archive node is down for less than 4 hours, it's dead, and you have to rebuild it. So when we're talking about these state issues, I think that, you know, the weird sort of situation that you're in trying to archive all of the state today, and then where, like I said, if you're down for 4 hours, you're out of the game. But at the same time, to say that the growth is only going to be like cataclysmic 2 years from now, that's, I think, I mean, again, I trust that number of 2 years, but that's, to me, in a sense, very optimistic, because I feel like you know, I don't need to die to go to hell, right? I think I'm already there, right? I already have serious issues dealing with the state.
So 2 pieces there. One is 2 years is a linear projection of usage of Ethereum. So if we think more people are going to build on Ethereum, and we don't give them better tools on how to build dApps ahead of that time, then we likely have less than 2 years. Alexi's roadmap of how long it will take to do all of his state rent plan is 3 hard forks, which is roughly 27 months.
That's funny. I love that. That's, I don't know, you couldn't write that in a movie, right?
There's a speeding train. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, someone needs to give Alexi more money. Like, I feel like...
Or any money? Or
Yeah. Can I share a couple
Yeah.
thoughts? I want to, like, these are important things. I want to make sure everyone's on the same page. So Alexei has received some grant money, so
Yeah,
his work's
yeah.
being supported. I'm not saying he doesn't deserve more, right? And I agree. He's like, I envision him as kind of like Atlas, like carrying the weight of the Ethereum world on his back, which kind of you alluded to a moment ago. The number, so this all started at DevCon, and this was like Peter Szilagyi, who originally provided estimates, and I can't remember whether he said 18 months or 2 years or something, but that was his estimate, right, for like how long we have. And yeah, like we're hoping that hard forks happen every 6 months or so, right? So best case scenario is like 18 months, so like we're definitely coming down to the wire a bit. But just to be very clear, it's not like Ethereum switches off if we don't get there. It's just that like the node count starts to decline, you know, so it's, yeah.
Well, you and I have a different level of cynicism in our delivery. So
We can play good cop, bad cop if you want.
well, no, I mean, it's sort of like, you know, that passage of time is the curtain being pulled back, and like, surprise, it's centralized, right? I mean, that's really, because if the network continues to run during that crisis and updates aren't happening, you're getting rid of, you know, there is no illusion that you're in your home running a node. For my dev team, I had to just go out to like this place called Micro Center, just where you buy computer hardware, and I had to spend like over $2,500 on hardware to build, to make a relatively powerful MacBook able to fully sync an archive node, right? I mean, that's not running Ethereum on your phone, right? There's like a divergence in the narrative there. Like, it's not, you know, $3,000 investment is nothing for a professional miner, but, you know, and I'm maybe, hopefully the only time I mention this entity's name, Satoshi's paper sort of assumed that it was a P2P network and that there weren't this hierarchy of miners and users, right? So if you're going to use these sort of proof of work models, these sort of Satoshi, you know, these Nakamoto-esque models, you do need to have this broad distribution of validators. Of course, there's other models that I think are legitimate and valid that don't have those distributions. So, I mean, but again, we kind of have to have this self-conscious, self-aware discussion about it. We can't just say, like, oh, we'll be fine, someone's going to show up and save us. Like, nobody's coming to save us.
Is there a possibility to create EIP where it reduces the gap between an archive node and a full node? Because deprecating archive nodes would be great, and I think after a few years we kind of know what Ethereum is all about. And for example, token transfers are 90% of the smart contract calls, and it's about, what, 60% of all transactions? Is there not a possibility to remove like the necessity of tracing and archiving all of these events into what's something that could be built into what the full node does?
That's a really good question. So now I do have to pitch what I'm working on. So that is what I'm working on, is building a system where you can tell the Geth client what you want to archive. And it only archives what you're interested in. And this is very similar to how Bitcoin actually works with accounts, right? Bitcoin tracks your account and keeps the table for, and I forget the names of all the different tables in Bitcoin, but it keeps track of the table for your balances so that you know what your balance is, but it doesn't keep the table for every account in all of Bitcoin. And Ethereum is lacking an analogous feature. And so that's basically what we're working on at Vulcanized DB. Well, it's a semantic discussion, right? I mean, we're submitting patches to Geth and Parity, like it's again a series of patches that would facilitate that. So you could go into Parity or Geth and say, I want to watch this contract address, I want to watch this event topic, give me, spit out the trace just for that. So what's in there, and I'm pretty cryptic, so I'm not going to say, what people are actually submitting those patches, but I'm paying them. So that's how that's happening. But yeah, so I think that moving forward, that is the answer. Is this sort of, we used to call it, it's a very confusing name, but when I was working on Tendermint stuff, we called it like a light node as opposed to a light client, right? It's not just like getting SPV proofs, but it's tracking all of consensus, but it's not tracking all of the history necessarily, right? It can't necessarily rebuild everything. And I think that's just an architectural thing that'll emerge. I mean, I guess this is me announcing that to the world or whatever, but I think that's the way to do it. And I think that, the archive nodes as they exist today, again, no disrespect to the developers who designed the protocol as it is, it's not sufficient. It doesn't really solve anyone's problems. The block explorers don't really use it, and as a normal user, there's no reason to use it. And so it's not really serving anyone, and it does need to be modified.
Hey, I'm interested in your view in like grants distribution. There's like several entities in the space that are like giving out money to like different projects. Some of them like may have like different focus. Do you think like the money given to grants is like spent effectively? Do you see like a huge difference between the different entities working in this?
I can't say much about the spend. I mean, I can say about what we know about the rewards publicly because I don't have any insider information about. I mean, we apply to grants. I was awarded an Ethereum Foundation grant. Frankly, I think I asked for I should have added a 0 to what I asked for. I just was off by an order of magnitude. That's a whole nother story. But do I think that the allocations as announced are efficient? No, not really. And I don't think that Ethereum is the worst offender in the space by any means in that regard. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Within the Ethereum ecosystem itself, I think there's a lot of opportunity to optimize. I think there's a lot of opportunity to coordinate. I think there's a lot of opportunity to say to people, like, we're going to give you this money and the condition is that you participate in governance, right? I mean, that's like almost an obvious, it's almost like a no-brainer. I feel like a lot of people, I don't mean it in like necessarily a derogatory way, but when you're running a business, sometimes the parsimonious thing for your business to do is to take the money and run, right? And it's a grant, and so a grant doesn't have a lot of strings attached normally. And I think that Ethereum, I wouldn't say has been victim to, but they haven't necessarily, the foundation hasn't necessarily aligned themselves in their issuance of grants with rational business behavior. Hopefully that wasn't too polite to be obtuse. But yeah, I think that it could be done better in the sense that there could be better coordination. And it could still be a very loose, like decentralized coordination. You have to type in this chat once a week when we vote. I mean, it could be very minimal. But I think already we're starting to see an inconsistency, a non-linearity in what contribution people are going to provide, what they're claiming they're going to do, and how much money they get announced, because we don't really know if they get that money or not. because the announcements don't really map to your payment schedule. I can say that from my experience. So maybe those teams actually have very reasonable conditions, and they haven't actually received the funds, because the funds aren't distributed on chain or anything. We don't really know, right? But the opacity, that's too opaque of a process, and from the outside it just looks like it's not very efficient.
Hopefully this is not a controversial question. What are your thoughts on Polkadot, technically as well as just the ecosystem?
I'm going to start at the beginning. I don't know how they got latex to print on a Polkadot background for their white paper, but they ensured that I would never read it in its entirety by doing that. So I'm going to start at the beginning. I've never read that whole white paper because it's on Polkadot paper. A moment of Zen, I don't know, we should all reflect on that. That's some sort of Zen cone. You're going to open up the coffin, there's only going to be a shoe. Read your Zen cones, folks. There's some sort of deep brilliance there that I don't understand. I'm very skeptical of fishermen as a concept. A ZK snark fisherman, again, all these little groups that we're in are all so deep, right? I'm sure there's somewhere in the universe some ZK snark construction that will work in the hypothetical that they're describing. But as I understand the technology today, fishermen just won't work, and they won't work in the general case. So let me see if I can give, with my limited knowledge of Polkadot, let me see if I can articulate my position without being too much of an idiot. So it's unclear to me. So if you have a system like Polkadot or Cosmos, I think they're very similar, and that's not a coincidence, right? Well, I don't know quite how you'd label it. You have to make certain strong claims about the relationship between the hub chain, or whatever you call that chain, and the side chains, or whatever. I do parent and child, but it's confusing because the parents are anyway. So you have the hub chain and the other chains that are connecting to it, and the hub chain has to be the fastest chain out of all of them if it's providing a union of state over all of them. And so that also means that in the case of Polkadot, if the Fisher model actually made sense, as again, my understanding, someone from Polkadot could show up and be like, Rick, we have page blah, 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 page 7, paragraph 3 says you're wrong. Okay, fine. But from my understanding of it, the Fisher process, so let's say that you have like a 3-second block time. That would mean that you would have to build the proof, and proving that the block was invalid, that was published from the parachain was invalid. You'd have to build that proof, distribute that proof, and all the evidence for that proof within less than 3 seconds, because then you have to vote on if that proof was legitimate. So you have to get the block, all of the Polkadot validators would have to get the block from this other chain. They have to get the fraudulent claim. They have to get all the evidence for supporting the fraudulent claim, which is at least another block, so at least 2 blocks. You have to get all that. You have to gossip that around everybody. You have to construct this proof, and then you have to now run your vote. So, I don't know about all that. Again, well, ironically, right, if you're IBM and you have some sort of, alien tech from Roswell computer where you can do all this centralized and in time, you don't have any problem. But to claim that you're going to do that in a permissionless network, I don't think that's going to happen.
We have a question from Ustream chat box. Do you believe that lowering the block gas limit could be a solution to prolong the life of ETH1X?
Wait, what? Oh, I get it. I broke my leg, so I'm going to walk slower, is what that sounds like to me. I mean, maybe just like go to the hospital and get a cast. Like, maybe do that instead. Like, it's a very engineering, it's a very parsimonious solution to the problem. We'll just make the blocks objectively shittier so we have more time to fix the network. Okay. There's worse solutions than that, frankly. But yeah, it's not an optimal solution. I'd rather not do that.
We have another one from Twitter, if that's okay.
Oh yeah. Thanks. I'm glad we've an emergent process here. This is wonderful. Let's keep them coming.
How hard will it be, in your opinion, to implement state rent on Ethereum? That's a good question.
State which?
State rent, or storage management fees, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. You don't want rent. You don't want tax. You want to call it some. I'm so not a marketing person. I think easy. Again, Alexei gave me he had a whole breakdown for how to do this. Again, very impressive. So I kind of would just say to whomever that is, go find Alexei's work and read about it. My personal view is that it almost doesn't matter how hard it is since it's imperative. It's existential. So however hard it is, it doesn't matter. You have to solve it. Whatever bitter pill the community has to swallow, they have to swallow it, or they're not a community anymore. So in that sense, I guess in that sense, to be truly strict about it, the question's irrelevant. It doesn't matter how hard it is. But I don't think from an engineering, let's all have an honest moment here. I mean, how much legacy Ethereum code is there really? Like, Maker is under hyperactive development, right? I mean, what are people really doing where they have a legacy code that can't be programmatically updated if we have a rent situation? I mean, because I think, for example, ERC20s, it'd be very easy to say, okay, well, some of your fee goes to the rent on because each account has its own row in the ERC20 basically, and if you get your token, then you have to pay your rent on your token. I mean, how hard would it be to almost at the minor layer within the actual node software enforce that rent in the ERC20 context, right? That'd cover, again, 85-90% of the traffic. Excuse me. So, that's kind of ugly from an aesthetic perspective. That's not a great sign of the community. Hey, everybody, we patched your ERC20s, whether you liked it or not. Deal with it. But, again, it solves the problem.
You've mentioned governance several times. You said cool words like voting. Would you like to give a parsimonious answer around Ethereum governance?
Ooh. So then we're having flashbacks to when I was in the other smaller room. I really think that people should look at a lot more at voting theory, political science. There's arrows and all these people have done all this research over literally hundreds of years on voting. So we might want to look at that stuff from a governance perspective. I think it's also worth noting that governance is something that, I wouldn't say it's uniquely human, but it's something that's existed, literally pre-humans. Whatever animal predates the human, they had leaders and governance, right? Governance is a really old thing. So I don't know that we necessarily need to invent a whole new language and a whole new concept and a whole new model. I think we would be better off, again, there's so much money in the crypto space, just go to a university and just buy a reputable department and get them to solve the problem, and then just hire some devs and just implement it and just move on. It's so yeah, but I don't think any of that's going to happen. I think that we'll continue to have the deadlock that we have in Ethereum for as long as possible, maybe longer than possible. I think the governance failure may be the failure of Ethereum. I think that there's very high likelihood that the stakeholders don't come to alignment. You know, Binance issuing their own coins on their own network. You know, how much do they need to align with what Ethereum's doing? And STOs in general, which I work on some STO projects. I'm generally a fan of them conceptually, but you know, Ethereum has, I think, a real user base and a real use case, which is a sort of alegal/extra legal financial services. But that's not a world computer, so maybe we don't promote that because it's not a world computer. All right, sorry.
Yeah, so I think you just touched upon it a bit. Assuming that I have this brilliant dApp idea and the money to pay you as a consultant, what would you recommend me to go for in terms of protocol? And I think you already mentioned your opinion about Polkadot, maybe more focused now on Ethereum, on Cosmos, and maybe more specific for what type of use cases you would go for one or the other.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's some free, a bunch of people are getting a bunch of free advice from me. That's great. I'm happy to do it. Generally what I advise my clients to do is federated proof of stake sort of side chain on Ethereum. So use Tendermint, do your internal agreement with Tendermint, have your validator set be represented in a Ethereum on-chain multisig because Ethereum's available today. And you can actually sort of rinse and repeat that. You can have your 7 validators in private or however many validators. I mean, they're permissioned, they're not really private. Like the whole point is that they're publishing their, I don't like the term private blockchain as an aside because the purpose of a blockchain is to create an auditable transaction log. So it's necessarily not private. A private blockchain is a oxymoron. It doesn't really make sense. So you take your permissioned set and you can synchronize that set of validators across multiple chains. So you could have that validator set synchronized on Ethereum, synchronized on Tron, synchronized on on EOS. EOS doesn't have finality, so I feel very uncomfortable talking about EOS. At least Tron has finality, right? So you can synchronize on one of these. You can synchronize your validator set on these other networks. Do your actual business in private on your private network, on your physically private network, and then publish your proofs to your counterparties on these public chains. And so that's what almost every project I work on has that structure to it. I started doing these in May 2016, and I've worked on, I don't keep a perfect dead reckoning count, but maybe like 8 of them. And they've all sort of used that same architecture. Some of them decided to invent Plasma instead of using Tendermint. And others have used other things instead of Tendermint, but most of them, we start with Tendermint because the Cosmos SDK is super good and works right now, and you can build stuff with it right now. So that's my general recommendation. I think in terms of, there's some details. Don't run your own virtual machine. Don't run the EVM. Don't write a new VM. Try to avoid VMs. I actually like TX VM. I was reading about that recently from the Stellar team. Or I'm sorry if I'm misattributing the team, but Dan Robinson was an author on that as well as this Olaf guy. I like that VM a lot. I like the VMs that are coming out of Casper Labs. So I feel as though they're working on more than one. They're very similar. The TX VM and that VM are very similar. Pact from Cadena, I forget which way you're supposed to pronounce it. They have a good VM, but generally I say for most people you don't need a VM. You can just, it's probably easier still to just very carefully write code in whatever language you're comfortable in, because you don't want people publishing arbitrary contracts anyway. You want people to publish, another loan. You specify what a loan is in your system. Okay, we're issuing another loan. You're not like, okay, random person, issue something that's not a loan. It's like, it's a network for issuing loans. So you don't need to really have a VM in there. Not a smart contracting language, at least. So that's let's see, was that the key points to what I pitched to my clients? Fast block times. So fast block times, a good story around checkpointing and how to handle empty blocks. Because in these systems you have mostly empty blocks, and you don't want to be spamming everything with a lot of overhead on empty blocks. And then we also do a lot of work to make sure that in these federated systems that I work on, almost all of the work that I do is actually in making sure that there's incentive alignment between the parties that are transacting in this multi-sided marketplace, which is what these chains are. Are there any more questions? Because I'm just going to spend the last couple minutes. Yeah, go for it.
Maybe a quick one. One of the challenges we're seeing, and this is closely related to governance in making any changes, including Ethereum 1x, including state rent, is that there seems to be like a social contract with developers, right? So this is actually why Constantinople was postponed. Even something as seemingly benign as like lowering the gas cost like pisses people off because they were assuming these invariants that existed that maybe we never had this conversation. So the question is, do we have an implicit or explicit social contract with developers? And if so, what is it? And what do we do about it?
I don't have time to answer that. So I think that there is both an implicit and explicit contract with developers. And I think that the Ethereum community, so if you think about the Linux community, which I'm familiar with, like the actual Linux kernel community, it's very clear when you go onto Linux dev who's talking to whom. There's hardware manufacturers, there's people who are trying to get hardware to work and they're not the manufacturer, and there's people running large amounts of infra, and everybody knows their shit, right? Everyone in the Linux kernel group knows how to write a kernel. I mean, even though it's a very, they'll teach you how, but like people are in that milieu, right? They understand what's going on. One of the problems I think Ethereum has from a messaging perspective is that we talk about building consumer dApps, and I think that is not. I don't think we're far enough ahead to do that, or I don't think we're developed enough to do that, which is going to segue into my last bit. So I think there is an implicit agreement and an explicit agreement with developers, and I don't think that. That's between all the members of the community, not just between the foundation and some other group. It's everyone collectively has this agreement collectively. And so I'm gonna part with this. So I did this in reverse. I gave a talk where I did the question and answer first, and then I'm gonna give the talk part because it's very brief. It's called the deep stack problem. So I'm gonna leave people with this problem. In the blockchain community at large, we have a group of people that are claiming that they'll be able to create a new internet in a relatively short period of time. And they're making this claim without really having like a company. They don't have a group of people that you can point to and say, these people are going to make this thing. So we don't have, in the blockchain community at large, there are people launching satellites. Right? That's a technically complicated endeavor, managing satellite communications. We have people building chips. We have people manufacturing ASICs. We have people talking about ASIC supply chains. That is also obviously a deep domain of expertise where people need a lot of ability. We have enormous conversations about governance, right? Again, hundreds of years of research in governance. We have people designing their own, not invented here, designing their own, smart contract languages, programming languages, huge domain, right? Distributed systems, huge domain. Consensus algorithms, huge domain. UX, like, what is React? Like, I've been coding for a long time. When I look at React, I'm like, this isn't JavaScript. What is this? I don't even know what it is. So we have React devs, we have normal devs, we have ASIC manufacturers, we have satellite launchers, and we have a bunch of VCs and other, another interesting thing about the blockchain community is we have investors that are of a novel type that, crypto investors, a double entendre, right? So we have VCs, we have crypto investors, and they are all saying, we'll have this done in like 7 years. And I'm like, dude, did you use Usenet? Do you know there was a decade before Usenet happened, and Usenet was always trash. Like, from a user experience perspective, Usenet was the bomb in 1990. It was like blowing up houses. It was the bomb, and it was still trash. You still had to sit and wait forever to get your news group to update, and that was the state of the art, and that took a bunch of nerds who were all experts in military research labs, decades, to make Usenet. So the idea that I love this ragtag group of people, but we're a ragtag group of people, we're gonna show up and we're gonna like, sit down, unzip our pants, and just like code up a whole new internet, including networking, satellites, UX, hardware. Yeah, no, that's not gonna happen, guys. Sorry, we're not, that plan is not gonna succeed. I left off data availability problems. I mean, even in this example, I'm being very terse. I'm not really enumerating every single issue, every single deep research topic that needs to be thoroughly understood before we can fulfill some of these very simple claims like Ethereum is a world computer.
So I just wanted to add, I think the biggest problem, within the conversation of these different parties, from investors, developers, and everything, and even with the state rent issue or with the grants issue, is that we don't have a clear vision. We are a very decentralized community, and the problem is that nobody wants to be highly opinionated about what the mission is. So we need to be more explicit about the mission that would make it so much easier to define what these social contracts are. So if the mission is to be as progressive as possible, the state rent shouldn't be an issue. But there's this concept of oh, you agreed that this would be deterministically like this, and now you have to just do what you promised. But no, the promise was to be progressive. The promise wasn't to be you're going to deploy your CryptoKitty and it's going to look the same in 20 years. The premise of Ethereum is to just continue to develop, in my opinion. And we just need to be more explicit about that. It just makes the social contract much easier.
Yes, and I'm out of time, so all I can really say to that is yes. But yeah, thank you everyone. It's been a pleasure.